Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to LeaderSHIFT. We are in conversation with local and global thought leaders, exploring business topics and, of course, tapping into their expertise and their experience. Our conversation is hosted by the Stellenbosch Business Institute. And, of course, we're more than a corporate education provider. We are also a strategic learning hub where leadership thinking is not just explored, but it is ultimately redefined. And through our network of thought leaders and industry pioneers, we don't just participate in the leadership conversation, we advance it. My name is Nozipho Mbanjwa-Tshabalala, and it is an absolute privilege to be hosting you today. Today's focus is the South African budget 2025. We should probably add 2.0 at the back of that. And my guest today to help us unpack this budget and what it means for business, what it means for the economy, for leadership, for economic strategy, is somebody who needs very, very little introduction in these circles. But nonetheless, it is such a pleasure for me to invite Khaya Sithole. He comes into this conversation with 20 years of experience in the finance industry. He provides services to a range of organizations, from listed companies to state institutions and nonprofits. He is a chartered accountant, an academic, a financial writer, a radio broadcaster, and an activist as well. His leadership extends to a number of boards across the South African landscape as well. But perhaps, let me say this, perhaps Khaya's biggest accolade is his ability to cut through the noise and help us to get to the most important questions and helps us to navigate the answers. Khaya, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Let me give you an opportunity to say hello.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Looking forward to this conversation.
Fantastic. Before we jump into it, Khaya, I do also want to extend an explicit invitation to everyone to say, we don't want to subject you to watching a conversation for 45 minutes. We'd love to hear from you. So I am carefully monitoring the chat. And if you've got comments and you've got questions and contributions to this conversation, please pop them into the chat, and then I'll try to, the best of my ability, to really bring in your voice and integrate your views into the conversation. So, Khaya, let me start off here. If you were to think about the budget that was delivered yesterday, and you were to condense it to a headline, and that headline was a reaction, your personal reaction to the budget, what would that headline be?
I would say it would be the triumph of pragmatism. And I think the reason that would be appropriate is that we now know that in spite of many people hoping that a solution to our public finance crisis was going to magically find itself, that's not how it works. So we've started off with an acknowledgement that, well, actually, the model that we've been pursuing for a very long time, which has really been fueled by the debt that we've been accumulating over the years, is no longer sustainable. And of course, when you cannot go to the debt dimension, you have to go to the tax dimension or the revenue dimension. And when you're talking about the revenue dimension, the clearest one is obviously to extract more taxes. And given the polarizing nature of the conversation around taxes, which led to the abandonment of the initial budget, what we've then seen developing over the past 3 weeks is the question of, well, can we find some middle ground that says that, look, we may not like it, but the fact is that we need to raise some revenue. We may not like it, but the fact is that we've got a public spending program that has to be funded. So what we then ended up with was a middle ground that says, well, actually, maybe we need to be a bit more gradual in rolling out this pain. And in that gradual time frame, you then say, but actually, if we find something better along the way, then that's what we'll adopt. So that's really how the budget ended up being crafted.
I love that. A triumph of pragmatism. I'm sure there are a number of media houses who would love to steal that headline, but you raise a very important question around tax. So let's stay there a little bit. I want to talk about VAT, the VAT issue, of course, but I also want to talk about the stance on income tax, because I think there we are seeing some interesting dynamics and the absence of wealth tax as well, Khaya. But let's start with VAT. So we see VAT being pushed through at 1% over 2 financial years. 0.5% in each year. Let's talk a little bit about what this means for taxpayers, but also from your perspective, Khaya, what does this mean for business?
But I think it's very clear from the taxpayers, everybody's worse off. Nobody would ever argue that a taxpayer would benefit from paying more taxes. So we do know that we already have a significant squeeze on disposable incomes, and that squeeze is coming from multiple dimensions. The first one is the fact that in the same budget, we are not seeing our taxpayers being compensated for the annual inflation creep. So that has been frozen for the past 2 years. So it means that incrementally taxpayers have been worse off in the past 2 years. And the reason that was obviously chosen as a route is that when you do apply that type of tax creep, it means that you simply then charge a bit less to compensate for the fact that taxpayers have to cater for inflation. So when the National Treasury does not apply that, it means that they don't give us what is due to us. So that is obviously a matter of practice. It's not a matter of law. So there's nothing that compels them to do it. It's just a practice that we've been accustomed to, which obviously considers the various multiple dimensions that we're all being exposed to. So when we then see an increase in the VAT rate, the increase in the VAT rate simply means that those that obviously are highly dependent on the basket of goods that is unavoidable have to be compensated in the form of a zero rating. Now, whether that goes enough is a matter of speculation. I don't think it is possible to get the perfect range of goods and services that can be zero rated. So households will indeed be worse off, but of course, this is the consequence of a poor a program of managing the public purse over many, many years, and this will ended up here. I think obviously the critical problem that you always have to deal with is that any tax policy change has particular casualties. Sometimes the casualties are much more direct and easy to map. So if you raise corporate income tax, for example, you kind of know what the effect might be.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's a really great analysis. I can still hear you, Khaya. You're still very audible to us. I think it's a really great analysis that you give us as we think about, the push through of VAT, but also income tax not being adjusted for inflation. Very quick one on that. Is the expansion of the zero rated basket sufficient? Does it balance out? Because, that's the counter argument that says, well, we are expanding the number of items we're going to put in that zero rated basket. Is that enough?
No, it never is. And part of the problem is that even in the definition of what gets zero rated, it's a question of trade-offs. So if the minister came to you and asked you what are the things that should be in that zero rated list, it will be everything that matters to you. It is everything that you use frequently. So naturally, when you're trying to figure out an answer across 60 million citizens, you end up with a lot of trade-offs and then say that we think this is what that represents the basket of goods that caters to the majority of the citizens of limited means. So it will not be an answer that says, well, the millionaires said that this must be in. So it's always a very, very difficult process. And what you end up with is something that can be defended in the sense that we believe that not only is it used widely, but it's also something that those that have a much more fragile income profile depend on more than others. So that's how you define it. So what then happened is that in 2018, when we had the first VAT increase, it was then a question of, well, actually, those that need to be insulated have to be insulated. So a panel was put together and the panel made recommendations, and those recommendations were then added to the basket. But obviously, even within poor families, there's always going to be particular dimensions that you cannot cater for. So you can be from a poor family, but you've got health challenges that make it difficult for you to actually capitalize on those basket of zero-rated goods because they create new problems for you. So it means that you do not get that type of insulation. So what we're seeing here is that it sounds like there's going to be a very small expansion on the list of those particular items, but this is something that you actually can only assess over an extended period of time when you do look at the incidences of taxpayers buying those goods and then the nature of the taxpayers that are buying a much greater proportion of those goods. Only then will you know whether a zero rating or the expansion of the packet makes a difference.
So I want to build on a little bit on that, and I know it sounds like I'm sitting in the negative space, and we're going to hopefully get to some positives in this conversation as well. But one of the criticisms of this budget, Khaya, has been the decision to follow through on the public sector wage increase, which I think is sitting at about 5.5% increase.
Yeah.
So it looks as if the increase in VAT is literally just going to be absorbed by this public sector wage increase. It's money in and money out at the end of the day. What do you think is, there's a perceptual impact that I'd love to hear you talk about in that regard. But is this the right thing for the South African economy right now?
So there's a couple of issues there. The first one is that the question of the civil servants' wage actually predated the budget. So what happened is that during the course of last year, there was a lot of bargaining between the unions and government, and that ended up with the multi-year wage agreement that was signed in. And always, we know how it starts. The unions ask for an impossible number, government asks for what they believe is an affordable number, and then ultimately we end up with some middle ground. Now, that number has somehow ended up always above inflation, with perhaps the exception of the COVID-19 period. So that particular agreement, unfortunately, is an agreement that is led by the Department of Public Service and Administration. So they are the signatories on behalf of the government. It's not a National Treasury Directive. So a National Treasury will always say that we don't think there's enough money. Please try and get a deal that works. And then they get told that the answer is 5.5%. They do not have a choice. They are compelled to actually abide by that. So a couple of years ago, the previous finance minister actually said he was not going to abide by that. And then he says, well, it doesn't matter that I've signed a multi-year wage agreement. If there are no resources, I cannot be compelled to honor it. The Constitutional Court agreed with him, but what that did is that it then emboldened the negotiators on behalf of the unions to then say, never again will be found under this particular dimension. So they're very clear and they're very explicit about that whatever wage that they sign must be binding in law. So that's the problem that we have. That relationship that the ANC in particular has with the unions is remarkably difficult to break apart. What we saw in the original iteration of the budget a couple of weeks ago is that, unfortunately, and I think very ill-advisedly so, the minister said, I'm asking for a VAT hike, and the very first thing that he mentioned that he was going to fund was an increase for the civil servants. The problem with that is that what you are now creating is that there is this story of the incumbents. So the incumbents are those that are in the civil service, and what defines them as incumbents is that they've got a job. So imagine going to citizens where 28 million of them are not are on social grants because they don't have jobs, and you've got millions more that are on the social distress grant because they also don't have jobs. So these are outsiders in the labor market. These are people who do not have a foothold in the economy, and then they get told that the reason you can buy a bit less tomorrow is simply because you've decided to reward the incumbents, people who actually have a foothold in the economy. I think it's remarkably ill-advised, but the reality is that that's the political process that we find ourselves in. So that's always something that is very, very difficult to understand, very, very difficult to defend. But I think what we know from our history is that the ANC in particular has got a serious anxiety about what happens when civil servants go on strike. So the ANC has taken the view that whatever it takes to avoid strike action, then that's what must be done, and that's where you see the civil service increases. There's another political dimension that is actually becoming quite interesting to observe, in that for a very long time, the upside for the ANC getting into bed and getting into this alliance with the unions was that the unions would then say, well, we're going to get our members to lobby for you in the ballot box. Well, I don't know how useful those members are now because the ANC keeps losing elections. So perhaps it's no longer as strong a conversation point to have as we have seen before. So that's the one item that still remains sacrosanct as far as the government is concerned. But I think going forward, if it's going to be the one thing that other parties say needs to be revisited in order for them to sign off on future budgets, I think it's going to be a big focus area. But it does come across as remarkably unfortunate that when you're asking everybody else to make a sacrifice, the first thing that you mention is that not only are you going to reward those that have a foothold in the economy, but their reward is going to be in excess of even inflation as it is. It's just not the way things should be.
I can imagine that conversation and that conversational point must have been a really tough one in these negotiations within the GNU as they signed off on this particular budget. But one of the other things, Khaya, that you've touched on that I would imagine would also have been a difficult talking point, it has been the expansion of the social protection net, the social relief distress grants, as we said, introduced during COVID as an emergency intervention. We are seeing that being expanded all the way to 2026, but we're also seeing, increases across the board in terms of the social protection net. Again, if you look at the trade-offs that are having to be made in this budget, what do you make of that call?
So there's a very difficult conversation regarding the country's articulation of what the social wage is and social protection is. So you start off with the universal understanding that left to their own devices, many citizens simply wouldn't be able to put a loaf of bread on their table. So there is definitely a moral and a social imperative for putting it together. But what has been missing over a 30-year period is the understanding that however you want to roll out that social wage and however deep and however wide you want to do it, there's only one enabling instrument, and that enabling instrument is the revenue that funds it. It's that straightforward. People don't have to like it. It's a fact of life. Now, what we've then seen is that because we never had a model of simply making sure that we generate enough revenues that are permanent in nature to fund what is clearly a permanent need. When we then got into the crisis point where we had to then add a new dimension, which was this COVID-19 grant, that particular COVID-19 grant suffers from one weakness. And the single weakness it suffers from is that it has no policy anchor. In other words, it is something that government says, but it was always temporary. So they can say that, they keep saying that, but what is also very clear is that at every point in time where they then have to say, well, when you say it's temporary, what is the end date? The end date always comes with the question of, well, how are you going to deal with the consequential fallout of denying people who have now become reliant on this instrument if you're now denying it to them? So you can imagine that the political headache associated with saying to citizens, actually, now go back on your own feet when we know that we haven't created an enabling environment or even the economic structure that enables you to do that. It's a very difficult conversation. So what we have is really this model where they keep saying that it's for 12 months. And the reason they keep saying that it's for 12 months is because they don't want to be able to then answer the question of, well, hold on, if you're saying it's permanent, it's a new expenditure line, where is the new revenue line? So in order to avoid answering that, they keep saying that, no, it's going to end. And at every single budget, they then say, we've decided to extend it for 12 months. So even yesterday, I mean, that line in the budget speech is a meaningless line because next month, or in the next 12 months, we're going to be in the beginning of an election year. There's absolutely no way any politician is going to say, we're going to deny millions of citizens access to this resource and then still expect them to vote for us. So the problem here is that the ANC has managed to get away without answering the difficult questions of saying, okay, if you're going to say that this is the social wage dimension that the country is pursuing, we need you to show us how it's going to be funded. So what they were able to get away with for a very long time is a simple question of, well, let's simply borrow. And remember, when you're borrowing today, you're condemning future generations to answering the questions that you should be dealing with now. So the reason we now have this debt crisis is that for a 15-year period, whenever the ANC was asked a difficult question, they simply said, well, issue another bond. So that's the problem that we have now. Now, the great irony of that is that you can have a political party that purports to act in the interest of the poor and the marginalized, behaving the way our government has behaved. Because what has happened is that the debt service costs that we're now paying are now actually eating into the budget of the social wage. They're crowding it out in the sense that now, because you cannot negotiate your way around the fact that you owe the banks, remember, default is the absolute last thing anyone wants to contemplate. You cannot negotiate that. You have to pay. So right now we're paying about 382 billion rand a year. We cannot negotiate that. It's actually the first thing that the finance minister has to pay. So once you've paid that 380 billion rand, which is about 22% of what we generate, only then can you start considering how to prioritize that social wage. So when you then look at the social protection measures, we are only spending a fraction of what we think we should be doing simply because we've decided to crowd out the spending by going to the debt markets over a 15-year period. So that particular tension point where one party says that this is what we want to do, and then all their actions are actually working in the opposite direction, that is the crisis that we're dealing with now. And hopefully, now that they're being asked to be accountable in the process of deliberating and creating budgets, we may see a reorientation of that. In other words, they must finally answer the question of where is the new revenue going to come from?
I think those are all just really, really fantastic insights. Khaya, I want to pick up on Petlo's comment in the chat saying it, and I think Petlo's referring to the social protection net actually does not benefit the poor and the working class in the long run, which of course is a conversation that we could have for a whole entire webinar. You've touched on two things. You've touched on the question of growth and you've touched on the question of debt. Let's talk about debt first, because I think growth is even harder. If we look at what was in the budget, is a projection that we're going to see the budget deficit coming down from 5% to about 3.5%. There has been some analysis that seems to suggest that maybe South Africa plans to take advantage of its presidency of the G20 and the B20 to maybe push through some debt restructuring, not only for South Africa, but for a number of countries on the continent. Does that equation hold for you, that if we're thinking about reducing debt, that's where we're going to get it right? Or should we be looking at other instruments more internally that are within our control to really bring down even faster and more sustainably that budget deficit?
So I think in light of where we are in the geopolitical climate of our time, it is remarkably difficult to imagine that anyone is going to be entertaining conversations around issues like debt restructuring. And what makes it remarkably difficult is that by every single country and every single jurisdiction is now dealing with the headache of the trade wars that have been initiated by the series of executive orders from the White House. So unfortunately, this year is very difficult to imagine that anyone is going to be looking at global issues when everybody feels that they are under siege and they need to deal with the local issues in order to insulate themselves from whatever emerges from the White House. So that's the one part of it. The secondary part of, well, how do you actually then start managing your debt properly? Well, I suppose the simplest accounting equation says that it's either you borrow less or you pay or pay the debt that you already have, or you generate enough revenue to be able to say that actually the debt is coming down as an organic issue. Now, in the South African context, we do not have a blueprint. We do not have a template for growing the economy to such an extent that we're saying actually our GDP is growing at a much faster rate than our desperation to borrow. And the reason I call it our desperation to borrow is that at some point in time, when you see elections looming and you see that all the projections that we got told yesterday about how much revenue and GDP might grow by, when that doesn't happen, to balance the books at the point in time when you've then made it clear that tax hikes are not where you're going to go, that is where you end up. And the key issue here is that it is not impossible for us to borrow. We are simply saying that it is too expensive for us to borrow. So the type of issues that you need to be able to deal with is firstly, can you grow your economy? I haven't heard any template or any model from any of these politicians that indicates that they have that particular model. Or the secondary issue, when you talk about what we can do internally, a big part of our problem statement is that because we spent 20 years for the better part of 20 years mismanaging the economy, we're actually paying much more on even the debt that we have than we should because we are in junk status. And the reason we are in junk status is, again, when you have an entire generation of political leaders that seems to believe that the national plan is a 5-year process rather than a much longer term project. They are only concerned about what it takes to get them to survive the next ballot paper. So that's been the problem that we've had here. So one of the key issues is that if South Africa is going to start addressing some of the longer term structural issues, we need to put much more effort into elevating our rating profile so that if we ever have to borrow, it becomes cheaper. I don't think we should be borrowing more at the rate we are, but if we ever have to do, we want it to be a bit more affordable. That's not going to happen at the rate that we are. And also, there are a lot of some of these bottlenecks that we've created. So if somebody says, okay, fine, think you can improve your junk rating status, and then it turns out that you're grey listed because, well, once I've given you the money, you cannot explain where it goes. Again, these are self-inflicted wounds that we can start fixing. So you need to be able to hear in a conversation that talks about these solutions, what all the complementary elements are. So it is not sufficient for a minister to stand up and say, we're going to grow 1.8, 1.9%, because I can tell you that by the time you speak to him, that number will be revised downwards. So that number has long lost credibility. I mean, you've spent 10 years growing at 0 point something percent, and now you stand up and then you say 1.9% without telling us what the new enabling instruments are. So unfortunately, there's also a credibility crisis associated with our budget in that we've seen enough to be able to say, actually, none of this makes sense. So we do need to do a lot more work on the internal dynamics of how we manage our resources before hoping that the global picture helps us. But I think this is a terrible year to be reliant on any of the global players to help us out.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a beautiful way of capturing both the debt side of this equation, but also the growth side of the equation. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about those growth projections, because as you've said, a forecast of 1.9% at an annual average growth rate of about 1.8%, when last year we only managed to grow at about 0.6%. But I think the thing that's really worrying, Khaya, is that if you then look at our peers, if you look at the likes of Nigeria on the continent, who are growing at about 3.1%, or if you go off the continent and you look at other emerging markets like Brazil, for an example, growing at about 3.7%, the disconnect between where South Africa is and where South Africa is projecting is going to be is just, it's really mind-boggling. And you've already sort of answered the question by raising the credibility crisis. But if we were to put on our optimistic hats, where are the places that we could potentially eke out a little bit more growth so that we can move slightly more towards the 1.9% mark and away from the 0.6% where we've been languishing?
So a part of the problem that we've had in recent years is obviously how our public and state infrastructure has actually become the bottleneck to doing business in South Africa. So if you look, for example, at what Transnet has been doing, condemning this economy to the doldrums over an extended period of time, if you look at the electricity crisis that we've had for a very long period of time, it means that you've got an entire generation of potential businesses that could have been growing and thriving that simply just didn't stand a chance because the cost of accessing, electricity infrastructure and the cost of transporting goods and services has been so incrementally higher. It's really then made very few businesses capable of surviving. So what it's done is that it's increased the concentration risks amongst the businesses that are thriving. So we do know that in order for us to start talking about the growth, we cannot focus on the few businesses that are already in the ecosystem. Most of them have probably found their equilibrium, their operational equilibrium. And when I say they found the operational equilibrium, it's a matter of, well, from the current tax base, from the current client base, and from the current citizens, we've essentially explored everything that can be sold to them. So unless people are in a position to earn more income, in other words, the economy is growing, we probably aren't going to make much of a difference in relation to that. So we need to be able to then say, when people talk about how to fix or how to open up these bottlenecks that have been crippling the economy, what are the efforts that are being put there? So there have been obviously some positive lights, and I think obviously, no pun intended, the fact that Eskom now tends to offer more light than alerts about darkness, that's a good positive sign. I do think that the logistics crisis is obviously our big albatross at this particular point. But it's also very clear that one of the biggest problems that we've seen is the inability to maintain and invest in new public infrastructure. So the consequence of that is that, well, actually, even if somebody said that I want to be able to open a business and service a new market, the cost of accessing that market is so expensive, I'm not going to be able to do so. The cost of moving goods and services across the country is so exponentially high, I won't be able to do it. So we need to be able to go back and say, what is the government's view on what is going to enable this economy to open itself? What is the government's view on what are the enabling instruments that are necessary in order to get us there? So when the minister stands up and says, well, never mind the fact for the past 15 years, the answer has been 0.5, it is now going to be 1.9%, we need to then be able to ask, what are the 3, 4, 5, or 7 things that you're going to do so differently? They are going to enable a business that failed 6 or 7 years ago with the same idea to put out here today and then be able to thrive. In the absence of what those enabling instruments are, again, that is the one line on the budget that has become the single most meaningless expression because it gets us nowhere. No one is going to wake up tomorrow and say, oh, this country is going to grow at 1.9%. I think that translates to 10,000 more clients for me or 1,000,000 more clients for me. Let me invest more. Because what you want to be able to do is that you want these signals that you're putting out there to then initiate some form of action. So I don't know if many people walk up today and say, yesterday's speech, I do think that I should open a bakery here because, well, now I think there's going to be a client base in the next 12 or 13 months. In fact, people probably walk up and say, well, it sounds like the cost of goods and services is going to be a bit more expensive. So perhaps I should not even explore the idea that I had yesterday. So we are seeing actions working in the opposite direction to what the rhetoric is saying.
Yeah, and you touch on both business sentiment and business confidence and consumer confidence all in one in that response, and both seeming to be tracking in the opposite direction. We've got a few minutes left, so I do want to encourage anybody who's got comments, or even if you have a question, I'll try and sneak it in if I can. Please engage with us in the chat. We'd really love to hear from you. I want to change gears a little bit, Khaya, and talk a little bit more about what's happening in the political arena. This budget was silent on the NHI, which we know is a political hot potato at the moment. It was also quite silent on the wealth tax, which we know is probably a contentious issue that must have received some attention in the negotiations with the GNU. What do you make of the things that didn't make it into the speech?
Well, I think there was no surprise from my part that issues like the NHI were not going to be mentioned. In fact, I refer to it as one of the most obvious casualties out there. And the reason it was always going to be a very clear casualty is that now you've got an acknowledgement by the state that says you do not have enough resources. And the minister has been very clear that, look, we cannot commit to new long-term spending, commitments when we do not have new long-term revenue sources. So when you then look at the scale of what the NHI might cost, it would have been impossible for the minister to maintain his credibility and his integrity by arguing on one side that we're so bankrupt, I'm asking you to give me more, and then saying, oh, here's another new spending commitment. It's unfunded, but we'll see how it works out. It's simply just not going to work like that. So that particular conversation is a conversation that's deferred firstly for economic and financial dimensions. It is also clearly a conversation that is going to be at the epicenter of the political trade-offs that we're going to see in the next few months. And what makes it particularly interesting is that the NHI is a unique instrument in the sense that the president signed it into law ahead of the general election. And that's very important in the sense that because he signed it into law, he didn't have to get the consent of anyone in the GNU because it didn't exist. It was a bill that was passed into law by a dominant ANC parliament after many years of consultation. So it is law, right? So other bills that have now emerged since then are then the type of bills that the other parties can object to and they can kill off if they don't want to vote into them. So now we need to be able to figure out how to then work with the laws that now exist, that now have to be implemented in one way or another. So the NHI is now that type of headache where the state has to figure out that, look, we've made this particular commitment and this particular commitment needs to be executed. And then everybody in the room is going to say, fine, you've got your law. We may not agree with it, but here it is. But now tell us where the new revenue source is going to be in order for you to roll it out. And until we have that answer, you simply cannot roll it out. So that's really what has now become the new political dimension. And the fact that the parties had enough muscle to actually stop an entire budget from being tabled is an important one, because now you imagine that in any conversation, the ANC will now a bit more deliberate in consulting before initiating a process, because otherwise, what's the point of wasting time if no one is going to support it? So I think that's a big positive development of the past couple of weeks, in that sense of unilateral decision making that really dominated the discourse for a very long time is now over.
So I want to talk a little bit about that unilateralism, because, depending on who you're talking to, the stalemate that we experienced in the budget is described and framed in different ways. Minister Kotongwane would want us to believe that it is reflection of a maturing democracy and a GNU that is working and is able to have difficult conversations and find itself. And others would want to have us believe that this moment is significant in the sense that it is a reflection of an inefficient coalition, an inefficient government that can't arrive at convergence on a very, very important economic and political issue. When you look at the stalemate and the fact that we've had this budget tabled a second time, what do you think is the proper and more appropriate framing of what's going on here?
Well, the most important thing is that for 30 years, we all gave the ANC an open corridor. And what that open corridor meant is that an ANC minister comes up with an idea, obviously going through the cabinet structures. By the time it arrives in parliament, it is guaranteed to be passed for a couple of reasons. So firstly, the one reason is that it could indeed be a reflection of the policy orientation of the party. So therefore, you do not expect ANC backbenchers to reject it. But we also have a very dangerous state of affairs in the country where the process of elevation to cabinet in the ANC model is that the more senior you are, the better your prospects are. So then you have a better part of 250 members of parliament whose ultimate wish is to be the one that presents the next bill to parliament. So these are people who have a sense of deference towards the cabinet ministers. So in other words, nothing that these ministers bring to the table ever really gets interrogated or challenged. On the other hand, you would have had opposition parties who, in some instances, and in fact, in many instances, would have very legitimate concerns about, what is being proposed, and they would obviously then offer alternatives. But then again, it's a meaningless process because, well, the ANC is still going to vote for what it wants to do. So that particular open corridor will then made it very easy for bad decisions and for bad policies to go unchallenged on the basis that the ANC caucus is going to vote it in anyway. So why does it matter that other people from outside the structure think otherwise? So what then happened at the same time is that we also had a very problematic process of dealing with Section 77 bills in particular, which is where all the money bills tend to be. In that for every other bill and for every other bill that's made it into law in South Africa, I can give an entire history of its journey from when it started being conceptualized as a bill to the initial comments process, to the synthesis of those comments, to the revision of the bill, and to the ultimate passing. So every other law is subject to some element of interrogation, whether it's superficial or substantive is a secondary issue. The exception has been anything that relates to money, because what tends to happen is that it gets tabled at the very last minute, and then there is the very truncated and remarkably superficial consultation window. And in that consultation window, they may indeed listen to 10 of you, but a finance minister of the ANC has said this is what he wants. And the portfolio committee run by the ANC and chaired by the ANC is going to sign off that this is what needs to be done. They'll send it to Parliament. The National Assembly, run by the ANC, is going to say yes. And in instances where it has to go to the National Council of Provinces, and National Council of Provinces has 8 delegations out of the 9, let's say whatever the ANC says must go. So you've had a very broken process. So what this does is that it then says, firstly, we need to find a better model of rolling out the consultation process and then making it as inclusive as every other element of lawmaking is. And then in instances where there is a rejection, we need to know how we then deal with that, because at some point in time, a budget has to be passed. So we need to have some deadlock breaking mechanisms that say, well, actually, in instances where it's a budget of 10 lines and we have consensus on 8 lines, do we pass it? And what do we do with the other 2 lines? So it's a big learning process. And I think perhaps a sense of arrogance that predated every other, budget making process until now is over. And that's to be welcomed. So I think that's the big part of it.
What is the likelihood that we could find ourselves here again? And I'm asking whether, is this a new precedent that we should get used to as South Africans, our new normal, these moments of stalemate, these moments of tension as these conversations happen, and this maturing of finding each other around difficult conversations?
It is definitely the new way in which things are going to happen. And I don't think this will be the end of it. I expect this to be a common and a recurring way of doing things. And the reason it will be like that is that what you will find is that if you try to map the budget, whichever budget you look at, against the manifesto wish list or the core manifesto wish list of all the parties within the GNU, you're not going to find the perfect model with obviously perhaps the ANC, because they tend to craft the budget, but everyone else is going to have a point of departure. Now, the question again is, when the president threatened to put together a deadlock breaking mechanism last year, it was something that was regarded as important, because you have obviously all these parties that are ideologically divergent and sometimes ideologically irreconcilable. And the question of how then do you get to a decision when so many of them have got different ideas about a critical public issue, a public interest issue. So what the president then said is that he said, okay, I'm going to put together some deadlock breaking mechanism, which is where this would have been vetted. So the budget will now firstly go to that particular structure. This structure will say, look, of the 8 items or the 10 items, we are happy with 6 or 7. These are the 3 that we need to deliberate on. So by the time the minister says, I've got a budget, he's then worked out whether it's worth talking about those 3 or whether it's simply something that must be abandoned altogether. So it really is inviting a change in the way these processes are run. We do know that it's a very lengthy process. So in fact, as soon as this budget is done, the National Treasury and the Finance Minister start the next budget cycle. So they have a ministerial committee on the budget where everybody puts their wish list. And then at the end of it, then you have an outcome. I suspect that that's a process that will now change. It will be a process that has to be a bit more inclusive, much more open, because so far it's been a very insular process. You don't know about it until the very last minute. And in fact, part of the problem we saw last month is that even cabinet members didn't know until the very last minute, because the 2% was regarded as market sensitive. I think what you're going to see now is a much more open and a much more consultative process. And by the time a budget has to be tabled, some consensus will have been reached. So we're not going to see a delay in the budget. We're going to see a much more different budgeting process.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I see Mark Kaliontis, I think, has sent us a beautiful question in the chat. I'll bring it up, but before I go there, let's go to Washington, D.C. very quickly. I mean, it's quite, I would imagine that it would have been impossible to really work through this budget without the noise of what's happening in the macro environment and what's coming out of the White House filtering through into the conversations. How significant is the Trump administration's stance towards South Africa right now in what's come through in this particular budget, Khaya? And then we'll begin to close by going to Mark's question.
It is remarkably important through direct and indirect means. So I think the direct means is obviously the fact that in yesterday's budget, perhaps they didn't have enough time to really crystallize what the implications of the US aid funding crisis might be, because there's obviously healthcare services that need to be funded in a different way, and we expect to see more of that going in the future. So that's not something that National Treasury is unaware of. There's also obviously the implicit consequences of that. Well, at this rate we're going, it's very unlikely that our bilateral trade relations are going to remain the same. So what happens if South Africans lose preferential access to some of those US markets? What is the immediate consequence of that? So it's something that is being canvassed. But what is also important is that South Africa has taken the view, at least in the past couple of weeks, that this idea of megaphone diplomacy through Twitter versus Musk and Trump is simply not the way to do things. So it's not a matter of us not being aware that we need to be able to deal with what those issues are, but it's simply a matter of, well, what is the best way to deal with it? And I think the budget of yesterday would not have been the appropriate platform because it would simply just ignite new, very distracting talking points without us focusing on what needs to be done on the finance dimension before the diplomats step in and try and normalize what is becoming an increasingly bizarre situation involving a couple of exes.
Yeah, involving a couple of exes. That's an interesting one. Mark is asking us then if we can pinpoint a number. He says, what GDP growth rate is needed to balance the budget deficit?
Well, at the rates that we've been doing it, where we haven't been growing for a very long period of time, you'd think anything approaching double digits is a good starting point. And the reason we had to say that we have to go as far and as high as possible is that whenever you have this low GDP growth, that's not what we should be focusing on and analyzing it. What we should be focusing and analyzing is that, well, if your GDP is only growing by 0.1%, for example, what is the growth of your population, for example? So if your population is growing at a faster rate than that economy, it means that everybody is becoming increasingly poorer. So in order for us to catch up to this decade and a half of absolute, dire growth, we'd have to do much more. So 1.9% is nowhere close to the number that we need to get to. We need to, again, as a country, we're allowed to set targets. We can then say, as a country, in the next 5 years, we would like to then get to a point in time where perhaps the balance between the GDP growth and the population growth and other dimensions is at this particular level, so that we end up actually not only catching up, but also then getting ahead of that particular curve. Because until you get ahead of that particular curve, what tends to happen is that when citizens become poorer, their reliance and their dependency on public resources keeps increasing over time. So it means that by not dealing with it now, in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, you have many more people that are reliant on the state social system, whether it's through direct social assistance packages or even through indirect resource allocation. So you actually end up paying the price for this. Again, you've had 3 decades of a party led by politicians who do not believe that you actually have to live with the consequences of the future. What they've done is that they've bought time, they've kicked the can down the road through the debt that we now find unsustainable. And the reality is here to bite us.
Final question to you, Khaya. If you were to sum it up, the biggest winners and the biggest losers of this budget?
The biggest losers of this budget are obviously citizens. I mean, it's not desirable for anyone to pay more taxes, but I think perhaps the winners are citizens in the sense that it is a budget that has received pushback, and that pushback has obviously been championed by those that we've elected into power, which means that whenever we go to an election cycle, people are going to be aware that, look, I would like people who are going to go out there and challenge this on my behalf. And if you're not the type of party that does that, I'm going to be skeptical about you. So I think that in the long run, the citizens are going to be winners in the sense that for many years, when the ANC was in unilateral decision-making process, no one could actually challenge things on our behalf. So if you remember, in 2018, they said that VAT is going up. We're like, well, why does it matter what anyone else thinks? No one can stop them. So I think perhaps the victory for us is that now we have a process of then saying, actually, we as citizens don't like this. We call our parties that are involved in GNU, and then we get them to lobby on our behalf to get better outcomes. So we are the winners and the losers.
We are the winners and the losers. And to go back to your initial headline, the triumph of pragmatism. And I think this conversation has certainly reflected that. Khaya Sithole, thank you so much for your insights, your expertise that you brought into this conversation. And just like that, the 45 minutes is up. Allow me then to just thank everybody who joined us, but also for everyone who participated in the chat. We really do appreciate you. A recording of today's conversation will be available on the SBI website shortly, and we'll be sending the link to each and every one of you so you can watch this again should you wish to do so. And again, I want to extend another invitation, and that's for LeaderSHIFT next month, which is going to be titled Lead Like It's 2035, What No One is telling you. Lead like it's 2035, what no one is telling you. The future isn't coming. Of course, it's already here. AI is outpacing human decision making. Economic stability is a myth. And the very definition of leadership is being rewritten as we speak. The real question is, will you adapt, or will you be left behind? That's a conversation you don't want to miss. My name is Nozipho Mbanjwa-Tshabalala. Thank you so much for the opportunity to host this LeaderSHIFT. It's over.